Hello again. This video is going to be on the quadratic formula part 2. I encourage you, if you're not already feeling good about the equations we looked at in part 1, to practice those a little more, just because this is going to be building on what we talked about in part 1. If you're ready though for part 2, here it is. We're gonna, for this first problem, be looking at how you solve this equation here. At this point, I think you probably already know how we're gonna start. What do you think the first thing that I'm gonna do to solve this quadratic equation? Maybe something over here, like setting it equal to 0. If I want to do that, I could start by subtracting x on both sides. You also, if you want to do it all in one go, you can. We also are going to have to add the 3. I'm going to do it a part at a time though. So after I subtract x on both sides, that'll cancel those. And then here I get a positive 7x equals negative 3. And then our second part is going to be adding 3 to make it equal to 0. And we're left with 3x squared plus 7x plus 3. Again, we had talked about in the first part, there are 2 different ways you can solve. You can solve by factoring. You can solve with formula. If you actually tried factoring this out, this is one of those ones that you can't factor, which is why quadratic formula comes in handy. Now that we've got it equal to 0, the next part we always do is substituting in the numbers. If you're feeling really good about labeling A, B, and C, substituting, I'm going to ask you to pause the video now and try it on your own. If you're not feeling as good, just keep watching. Maybe some of you paused. If we want to substitute, I'm going to be substituting A as 3, B is 7, and then C is the number 3. So when we go to substitute, it's going to say x equals negative b, negative 7, plus or minus square root of b squared, so 7 squared, minus 4 times a times c, all over 2a. By the way, when we're in class, I always say that I don't expect you all to memorize this. I place so much more value on being able to know how to use it as opposed to memorizing formulas. That said, you, like many other students in the past, may end up doing so much practice you have it memorized, but I was just kind of reciting it from memory. Don't feel like you have to, sit down and memorize this huge formula. After we've got it all substituted in that last video, I always talked about the next part focusing on figuring out what that square root is. I would love for you to pause the video now, try to see how much of the math you can do, and then resume the video to see what we end up looking at. Don't feel like you have to go too far though, because this is different than some of the other problems we've looked at. All right. If you are joining us back to kind of see where this goes, that next part we had said was we're going to focus on the square root. I've got negative 7 plus or minus square root of 49. 4 times 3 is 12, and then 12 times 3 is 36. So I'm just going to go ahead and write minus 36 all over 2 times 3. Well, 2 times 3 is 6. We could keep going. Am I going off the video? Be a little further. Hello. We get negative 7 plus or minus square root of 49 minus 36, which is 13, all over 6. And this is where I'm going to pause. We, in part 1, talked about you want to keep doing the math until you figure out what your square root equals. And I'm pausing here because I'm looking at the square root of 13. Why do you think I'm pausing there? Well, square root of 13, there isn't a square root of 13, right? We've got square roots of 16, square root of 9, but there is no square root of 13. I'm going to pause here with doing the math because it's going to be different than the other ones we've done because you can't take the square root. The biggest mistake I see with students is they just start saying, okay, well, I'm just going to say negative 7 plus or minus 13. Let's just forget about the square root. You can't just forget about the square root. That's my dog in the back. You can't just forget about the square root if you can't take the square root. It's still part of the problem. Our answer is going to have a square root in it because We can't take the square root of 13. Now, when you think about square roots, we had that whole lesson on simplifying square roots, and maybe that seemed like a little out of place at the time. You're like, oh, I thought we were talking about quadratic equations. Why are we looking at square roots now? We were looking at how you simplify square roots for problems like this. One of your options, looking at this, is can you simplify the square root? With the square root of 13, 13 is a prime number, so you actually cannot simplify the square root. We can't simplify the square root, so it means it's going to stay square root of 13. Because this is a square root, you could, if you wanted, write negative 7 plus square root of 13 over 6 and negative 7 minus square root of 13 over 6. But there's not much more you can do. When you've got a number like negative 7, an integer, and a square root, you cannot add these together. It's almost like what we had talked about with combining like terms. You're not going to be able to add a number and a square root together because they're not like. Same down here, you couldn't subtract them either. So this is as far as we can go. We can't add or subtract these. We can't divide by 6. So that's our final answer. It looks crazy, but remember at the beginning when I said like this is one that you can't solve by factoring? You can't solve by factoring because this crazy stuff is what the answer looks like. So another reason why we've got multiple options, right, is you're not going to be able to solve by factoring when this is what your solutions look like. So when it comes to quadratic formula, there's a couple different options for what can happen. In part 1, when we got to this square root, every single time we were able to actually square root the number. That's option number 1. Option number 2 is you get a number like 13 that you can't square root, that you can't simplify, so there's nothing else to do. And these lovely things are what your answer choices look like. The last option, I'm going to show you with one last problem. And let me clean the board up. Our last one we're going to look at is going to be 7x squared plus 6x minus 3 equals 0. If you want to go ahead, pause the video now, see as far as you can get with it, and then come back to the video to kind of check in to make sure what you were doing was correct, and then see how we finish up this problem. I think that is a great option, so I recommend pausing now. Okay. And you have come back. Maybe you've got some math already down. Looking at this, we've already got it equal to 0, which is lovely. So we go ahead and I'm going to label my A, B, and C and substitute. When you substitute, it's going to be, I'm going to write x equals negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c. Make sure you get that negative sign on the 3. All over 2a, which is 7. And then our task is to figure out what all of this equals. When you go through it, you've got your negative 6 plus or minus square root. 6 squared is 36. How do I want to do this? 4 times 7 is 28. A negative 28 times 3. 4, 6, 8. Okay, so we get 84. And because there's 2 negative signs, that gives us a positive 84. I'm going to erase my scratch work. All over 2 times 7, which is 14. I'm going to keep going with that. That's negative 6 plus or minus square root of 36 plus 84 is 120 all over 14. If you have up to here, that's awesome. If you kept going, that's also awesome. I'm curious what you did. Looking at this, again, we've got a square root we cannot take. Some people I've seen who do this problem end up saying 60. Remember, square roots are not the same thing as dividing by 2. So square root of 120, there is no perfect square root. There's square root of 121, that's 11, but no square root of 120. So just like that last problem, our answer is going to have a square root in it. There's going to be a square root in our answer. Unlike that one we did at the beginning of this video, there is something you can do with the square root of 120. Square root of 120 is one of those square roots that you can actually simplify. If you recall, we said there's two different ways you can simplify square roots. You can simplify them with a factor tree, or you can simplify them by finding a number inside 120 that you can square root. For the sake of space on my board, I'm going to do it the second way, finding a number inside 120 that you can square root. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say the square root of 120. I know that is the same thing as 4 times 30. 4 times 30 gives you 120. I've chosen that because 4 there is a square root of, so I could say 2. And then 30 there isn't a square root of, so I can keep it as 2 square root of 30. What I've done, now that I've simplified the square root of 120, is I can go ahead and replace that here. So I'm going to say negative 6 plus or minus. Instead of saying the square root of 120, I'm going to write 2 square root of 30, and it's still over 14. Now, just like in that first problem, I can't add or subtract these because you've got a number and a square root. Nothing divides by 14 evenly, but you can keep going by simplifying this fraction. A different way to think of it, and I think it might help, is because this line is going all across both terms, we're saying I'm dividing everything by 14. Another way to think of this as negative 6 over 14 plus or minus 2 over 14 square root of 30. Again, that square root of 30, almost like a variable where you're just bringing it down. It's not getting divided. I've written it like this so that you can see both of these fractions we can't divide, but we could simplify. So for my final answer, I'm going to bring it down a little bit. I could divide both of these by 2. That's going to leave me with negative 3 over 7 plus or minus. Both of these I could divide by 2. So that's 1 over 7 square root of 30. There's a lot of different ways you can see this written. You could see it written like this. You could see it staying like this, but swapping out the numbers. Let me say that a different way. You could see instead of breaking it into 2 fractions, keeping it as one big fraction. Just like we did where we divided everything by 2, I could say 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. 2 divided by 2 is 1. You can write 1 square root of 30. But once again, like a variable, that 1 is not necessary because it's saying 1 times square root of 30. All over, if I divide 14 by 2, I get 7. Notice all the numbers are the same. You've got your negative 3 over 7. You've got your plus or minus sign. And then there's that invisible 1 here. So 1 over 7 square root of 30. Lots of different ways you can see it. Sometimes people do separate it. So they say like negative 3 plus square root of 30 over 7. And then negative 3 minus square root of 30 over 7. Like we did when we break it into 2 fractions. The point is, again, it's going to look weird to you because it's got a square root in it. And we're not going to be able to keep going beyond this. We can't keep going because you can't add a number and a square root together, and there's nothing else that we could divide by 7. These, again, I know look crazy, and just like that last video, I'm going to say they look crazy, they feel uncomfortable, it looks like a lot, but the more you do, the more comfortable you'll get with them, I promise. So hopefully this video helps with that. Remember, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions on this. It's very understandable if you have questions on this, so I am here to help. Hope you are having a wonderful day, and I will see you all soon. Thanks. Bye.